She almost walked right past him. That's the detail that still keeps Emily Carver awake some nights. 3 years later, in a house with actual heat and actual plumbing and neighbors who don't have to drive 2 miles to borrow a working phone line. If she had taken the other trail that afternoon, the one that cuts along the ridge instead of dropping down toward the creek, she never would have heard the sound. And if she never heard the sound, a 78-year-old man worth more money than her entire home county combined would have died alone in the mud, less than 4 miles from a resort with his own family's name carved into the sign out front. Nobody would have found him in time. Because 3 months earlier, that man Walter Hensley, the industrialist Forbes once called the last honest tycoon in America, had vanished off the face of the earth. No note, no ransom demand, no body, just an empty hiking trail, a rental car parked and locked in a resort lot, and a country that had spent 89 straight days asking the same unanswerable question: where is Walter Hensley? The answer, as it turns out, was lying behind a fallen oak tree in a stretch of forest so far off any marked trail that professional search and rescue teams with dogs, with drones, with thermal cameras had walked within half a mile of him twice and never known it. He was found not by a helicopter, not by an FBI task force, not by any of the machinery a nation mobilizes when a billionaire disappears. He was found by a 19-year-old girl with a canvas sack full of wild mushrooms, who had never once in her life heard his name, and who was about to make a decision in the next 60 seconds that would end up saving a lot more than one man's life. Stay with me here, because I promise you, the twist in this story isn't the part everyone already knows. It's what almost happened 300 miles away in a glass office on the 51st floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, while Emily Carver was still trying to keep a stranger's heart beating in a cabin with no electricity. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start where she started, on a mountain most of America couldn't find on a map if their lives depended on it, which, in a way, is exactly what was about to happen. Mill Hollow, West Virginia, isn't really a town. It's a scatter of houses strung along a gravel road that climbs into a fold of the Appalachians, a place where your phone loses signal a full mile before the turnoff and never quite finds it again. The nearest grocery store is 26 minutes down the mountain. The nearest hospital is closer to an hour, longer if it's raining, which, in October, it almost always is. Emily had lived there her entire life, first in a small house with her mother, and then after the accident that took her mother when Emily was 15 alone, in a cabin she inherited that had no insulation, no working furnace, and a roof that leaked with clockwork reliability every spring. She never met her father. She never finished high school, not because she wasn't sharp enough, but because at 16 she had to choose between algebra homework and a diner shift 40 minutes down the mountain, and rent, as it turns out, does not care about your report card. By 19, her life had a rhythm carved so deep it barely felt like a choice anymore. Up before dawn, into the woods with a canvas bag, hunting ramps and wild ginseng, and the last morels of the season, things she could trade to a buyer in town for enough cash to keep the lights on. Then 6 hours on her feet at the diner. Then the walk home in the dark, along a road with no streetlights, to a cabin that stayed cold even in the middle of summer. She wasn't bitter about any of it. People got that wrong later, once the story exploded, and reporters tried to paint her as some tragic Appalachian orphan waiting to be rescued herself. She wasn't waiting for anything. She was tough in the specific, unglamorous way that only comes from a childhood with no safety net. She knew every root and rock on that mountain, could read a sky 2 hours before a storm hit it, could tell you exactly which mushroom would feed a family and which one would kill it in under 6 hours. She didn't need saving. If anything, the woods had already made her into someone who did the saving. The accident that took her mother was almost absurdly small. The way tragedy in poor places so often is no drama to it. No villain, just a patch of black ice on a county road at 6 in the morning and a truck that couldn't stop in time. Emily was 15. She remembers being told by a sheriff's deputy standing in her own kitchen, still in her pajamas, and she remembers that the thing that broke her wasn't the news itself, but the deputy's face while he delivered it. The particular kind of pity reserved for people everyone already assumes won't land on their feet. She decided, somewhere in the weeks that followed, that she was going to prove that assumption wrong, quietly, without anyone's help and without anyone's pity. 4 years later, she still hadn't told a single soul in Mill Hollow that some nights the cabin got so cold she slept in her coat, because admitting it felt too close to admitting the deputy had been right about her. What she had no possible way of knowing, what nobody on that mountain could have known, was that the woods she'd walked 10,000 times were, on one gray Tuesday afternoon, about to hand her something that would ripple all the way to a glass tower on 57th Street. Relief hit Emily so hard her hands started shaking again, this time for a completely different reason. "I'm Emily," she told him. "You're safe. You've been sick a long time. What's your name?" He was quiet for a long moment, like he was reaching down into himself for something buried deep and half lost. "Walter," he finally said. "Walter Hensley." The name meant nothing at all to Emily Carver. It meant everything to the rest of the country. Emily didn't own a television. Her cabin had no signal strong enough to run one, even if she had. She had a second-hand flip phone she used maybe twice a month to check in with the one aunt she still spoke to in Ohio. So when Walter, weak, still healing, but coherent, now asked her, almost sheepishly, if she could help him make a single phone call, Emily had no earthly idea what she was about to set in motion. She walked the 2 miles to her neighbor's place, the only house on the mountain with a landline that reliably worked. Walter recited a number from memory. A private line he said only 4 people on the planet actually had. It rang twice. "Dad?" Richard Hensley's voice cracked wide open on that single word. And Emily, standing there holding the receiver out toward the old man, watched a person who had just survived weeks alone in the wilderness cry harder in that moment than he had in the entire 5 days she'd known him. Within the hour, that one impossible phone call triggered a chain reaction Emily could not possibly have prepared herself for. Richard Hensley didn't just call an ambulance. He didn't just contact the county sheriff. He chartered a private medevac helicopter, called the FBI office that had spent 3 months running his father's case, and had a plane wheels up out of Teterboro before he'd fully finished processing what he'd just heard on the other end of the line. Local news picked up the story of a helicopter setting down in a field outside Mill Hollow within 20 minutes. National news had it within the hour. By the time that helicopter actually touched ground, kicking up a storm of wet, dead leaves in the field behind her neighbor's property, news vans were already lined up along the gravel road, reporters half sprinting through mud in dress shoes, elbowing each other for the first usable shot. Walter Hensley, missing 89 days, presumed dead by nearly everyone who'd been paying attention, was carried out on a stretcher, alive, in front of live national cameras. And walking alongside that stretcher, blinking against a wall of flashing lights she had no framework for, no idea it was even coming, was a 19-year-old girl in a second-hand jacket who had just learned, minutes earlier, that the man she carried 3 miles through the forest was worth more money than her entire home county combined. She didn't take a fortune for herself. She took a job, a real one, with a real salary, working alongside people who'd spent entire careers in emergency medicine, helping decide which kids from towns exactly like Mill Hollow got a shot she'd never been given herself. Within a year, she'd enrolled in an accelerated EMT certification program, funded entirely through the very foundation carrying Walter's name, with plans, she said, to eventually go further still, nursing school, maybe beyond that. Walter Hensley made a full recovery, though he still walks with a permanent limp from a leg that sat broken and badly set for weeks in the wild. He retired for good this time, handing full control of the company to his son. But he kept exactly one standing appointment on his calendar every single year, without fail a visit to Mill Hollow every October, to that same cabin, to sit at that same small table, across from the girl who had talked to a fevered stranger through 2 of the longest nights of her life, with absolutely no idea whether he'd ever wake up to hear a single word of it. He calls her, to this day, by a nickname the press latched onto and never let go of. He calls her his second daughter. On the 3rd anniversary of the rescue, a local reporter asked Walter what he actually remembered from those 5 days in the cabin, given how much of it he'd spent unconscious or lost in fever. He said almost nothing came back. Clearly faces, sounds, the shape of the room, all of it arrived in broken pieces, the way dreams do, except for one thing. He said that somewhere in the fog of it, he remembered a voice. Not the words, not exactly, just the fact that it never stopped. He said he'd spent close to 50 years running a company, closing deals worth more money than most countries' annual budgets, and that nothing in any boardroom had ever mattered to him the way that one unbroken, unfamiliar voice had, talking to him through the dark, for no reason he could have understood at the time, and for absolutely nothing in return. So why does this story matter? Out of every quiet rescue that happens in this country every single week without a camera anywhere near it, why did this particular one become something an entire nation couldn't stop talking about? I think it's because Emily Carver's decision in those woods exposes something most of us would rather not admit about ourselves. We tell ourselves we'd help. We tell ourselves that if we found a dying stranger deep in the wilderness, of course we'd do whatever it took, no hesitation. But the honest truth is, most of us make dozens of smaller versions of that exact decision every single week. And we don't always choose the way she did. We see someone struggling, and we run the calculation first. What will this cost me? What do I get back? Is this convenient right now? We help when it's easy. We help when there's something in it for us, even if that something is just recognition. Emily didn't have the luxury of running any calculation at all. She had a 19-year-old body, a cabin with no heat, and a stranger who was going to be dead within hours if she didn't act immediately and completely, with no idea whether it would cost her everything she had left. And she made that decision before she had time to talk herself out of it. And here's the part that matters even more than the woods, the part that goes past the headline. When the reward finally arrived. $7 million. More money than most people will see across 3 lifetimes. She turned it down. Not out of performance, not for the cameras, but because she understood something a lot of us lose sight of the moment a number that large gets put on the table. She understood that the actual value of what she'd done lived entirely inside the moment she did it, before anyone knew, before there were helicopters, before there was a name attached to the man on her back. Putting a price on it afterward wouldn't have honored what happened out there. It would have quietly erased it. Walter Hensley didn't just get a second chance at life because a stranger heard a sound she could have easily walked past. An entire company, 11,000 employees, and every family, depending on those paychecks, a legacy 3 generations in the building. Got a second chance, too, because one exhausted young woman's 5 uncelebrated days happened before anyone else understood exactly how much was actually riding on them. That's the real lesson buried inside this story. Not that good things always happen to good people, because you and I both know that isn't true nearly often enough. The lesson is this. The moments that end up mattering most in a life rarely announce themselves ahead of time. Most of the time, they just sound like a low, ragged noise coming from somewhere past a fallen tree. Easy enough to walk right past if you're not the kind of person who stops long enough to listen. Emily Carver stopped. And because she stopped, a girl who owned almost nothing in the world ended up giving something that no fortune on earth could ever actually buy. There's a strange kind of symmetry to how this story actually ends, if you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. A man who built an empire out of a scrap metal yard, who spent his entire life being told that everyone around him wanted something from his money, ended up owing his life to the one person in 3 months of national headlines who never once asked him for anything at all. And a girl who grew up believing, quietly, that she was the kind of person nobody ever came looking for, ended up being the only one who found him. The only one, out of thousands of trained searchers with helicopters and thermal cameras and every resource a nation could throw at a problem, who actually walked close enough and stayed quiet enough to hear him. It's tempting to tell this story as though the woods delivered some kind of justice, as though Emily was owed a reward for a life that had handed her so little, and the universe finally settled the account. But that's not really what happened, and Emily herself would be the first to tell you that. She didn't get lucky. She wasn't due for a miracle. She simply made a choice. The hardest version of the same choice she'd been making quietly her entire life, long before any cameras were watching. The choice to notice someone else's suffering before her own exhaustion, before her own fear, before any calculation of what it might cost her. Most of us will never carry a billionaire 3 miles through the wilderness. That's not really the point of a story like this one, and it would be a mistake to walk away from it thinking the lesson only applies to people standing at the edge of some dramatic, camera-ready moment. The real test almost never looks like that. It looks like noticing the coworker who's gone quiet for 2 weeks and actually asking if they're all right, instead of assuming someone else will. It looks like stopping for the stranger with the flat tire on the shoulder of the highway when you're already running late. It looks like picking up the phone for the friend who's called 3 times this month and you still haven't called back, because it's easier not to. Every single one of those moments comes with its own quiet excuse built right in. You're tired. It's not your responsibility. Somebody else will handle it. Emily had every one of those excuses available to her that afternoon in the woods, and arguably more legitimate ones than most of us will ever have. She was exhausted, she was alone, she had no way to call for backup, and she had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose. She helped anyway. Not because she was fearless. She said herself, later, that she was terrified the entire 3 miles back to that cabin, certain more than once that her legs were going to give out under both of them. She helped because somewhere along the way, she'd decided that being scared was never going to be a good enough reason to walk past somebody who needed her. That's the part of this story worth actually carrying with you. Long after the headline fades and the next viral moment replaces it in everyone's feed. Not the $7 million she turned down, not the helicopter, or the indictment, or the company that stayed intact because of 5 days most of the country will never fully understand the weight of. Just this. Somewhere out there, right now, there's a low, ragged sound most of us are perfectly capable of walking past. The only real question is whether you're the kind of person who stops. If this story hit you the way it hit me putting it together, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because there are a lot more stories exactly like this one waiting. Real people, real choices. The kind of moment that never quite makes the front page, but absolutely should. Let me know in the comments. If you were standing in Emily's place, alone, out of cell range, with a stranger who might not survive the walkout, what would you have done? Before you go, sit with this one last thought. Walter Hensley has, by any measure, one of the most recognizable names in American industry. His face on magazine covers, his signature on contracts worth more than most towns will ever generate in a century. And yet, the single most consequential 5 days of his entire life were spent completely unconscious, in a cabin with no electricity, kept alive by someone whose name nobody in the world knew yet. All that power, all that money, all those decades of being the most important person in every room he ever walked into. And in the moment that actually mattered most, none of it could do a single thing for him. Only a stranger with nothing at all could. Maybe that's the truest measure of what any of it is worth in the end. I'll see you in the next one.